Now we're doing ZyBooks 11.4, Class and Instance Object Types. A program with user-defined classes contains two additional types of objects, class objects and instance objects. A class object acts as a factory that creates instance objects. When created by the class object, an instance object is initialized via the __init___ method. The following tool demonstrates how the init method of the time class object is used to initialize two new time instance objects. Okay, so we have this same time constructor that we had before, and then we called it, when we created a new object called time1, we call time paren. We're not really calling the class, it just looks like we are. We're actually, it kind of magically substitutes the init statement in there instead of this. And then we are setting the hours and minutes ourselves. Now, a class attribute, this is an object attribute, okay? A class attribute is shared among all the instances of a class, or it's actually more accurate to say that it exists outside of them. Even before you create any objects of that class, that variable exists and you could access it. This one is marathon runner. It's outside of the init and it's above it. So you could say marathon runner dot race underscore distance. You could access that even before you make any objects of that class. So I don't really like him saying it belongs to all objects. It does sort of, but it really exists on its own. You can look at it this way. Marathon, here's what I was saying. This is the usual way of accessing it. You say the class name dot and then the variable name or the attribute name. You could, if you have objects created, you could say object name dot and then that class variable name, but it's really much more common just to use that. An instance attribute can be unique to each instance. So this self.speed, that's an instance attribute. Race distance is a class attribute. I know this is a little confusing, but this belongs to the class because it's outside of the constructor. And then anything inside the constructor belongs to objects. Okay, if you remember it that way, it belongs to an object if it's in the constructor. If it's outside the constructor, it belongs to the class. Okay, so here we can have race distance equal 42.195. That is a class attribute. And you can get to it by saying marathon runner dot race distance. This one is an object attribute or an instance attribute, either way. And you can get to it by saying runner1 dot speed. Now you can get to this race distance using runner1 and runner2, but that's not the usual way to do it. Okay, here if you change the GMC offset class attribute, it'll show that it affects the behavior of all the instances. Okay, so they've got the class attribute called GMT offset. That's the Greenwich Mean Time. And so every time zone around the world keeps incrementing by 1. And so that's what that's referring to as the offset. I think in Central Time we're offset 6 or something like that. Okay, so we have a constructor where we have hours and minutes, and we're initializing those to 0. Then we have a method called print time, and we're setting offset hours equal self.hours plus self.gmt offset. And so that way you can determine what your local time is, as well as Greenwich Mean Time. So we've got time 1 equal time 1 equal hour, time 1 hours is 10, time 1 minutes is 15. Set something up for time 2. Then you can print Greenwich Mean Time but when you call print time. Note that class and instance attributes actually have unique namespaces. We talked about namespaces before. Now, if you need additional variables just to help you calculate things, you can put them in here. Just don't put self in front of them. And then they'll be just plain old ordinary local variables. So if I wanted to have 1 in there for some reason, I could say ONE equal 1. Okay, that would be a local variable. And then I could use it with these other things if I needed to. Okay, so what type of attribute is number here? It has self in front of it, so it's an instance or object attribute. What type of attribute is number? It has self in front of it, so it's also an instance attribute. What about area code? It's above init, and it doesn't have self in front of it, so it's a class attribute. In some languages, they call class attributes static attribute or static variables.